Hey, Julie.
Hi, Richard.
How's it going?
It's good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks for being interviewed. Why don't we start off by having you introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do?
Sure. My name is Julie Melki, and I have spent my entire career dedicated to mental health, social emotional learning, and special education. And the common thread throughout my different career experiences has really been centered in mental health, but I have spent the last decade supporting large networks of schools in developing special education and processes and supporting all of their mental health providers within the schools.
Nice. So I'm going to just start off with a big question. What does it look like for school systems to effectively support their special populations?
What does it look like for schools to support their special populations? Oh
Yes,
my goodness, that is a big question.
a big question.
I think that always, whether you're talking about students with learning differences or students who are more typically developing, it means really understanding the community you serve. And that means not just understanding what challenges they might experience, but also knowing what makes your community beautiful and special and unique, because I think that is what's going to really allow you to have develop those authentic relationships with your students, with your families. And that to me is what is most foundational to being able to serve your students well. I
Yeah.
think once you have a foundation that is strong and really rooted in respect and trust and those authentic relationships, how you serve your kids means thinking about every kid as a unique learner and what helps them learn the material best. So we all learn differently. You learn differently than I do. And if we are willing to take the time to figure out how each student learns differently, we are going to be able to make that much more progress in allowing them to achieve their true potential.
It's a loaded and great answer. And as you mentioned, it does require us to look at each student as an individual and really cater our approach to make sure that their learning needs are met, not just as a sort of blanket exercise, which kind of leads me to my next question pretty organically. So if you were to reimagine the way that we do special education, what would you do differently?
Stop calling it special education.
Why?
I think I've been thinking about this a lot lately and really have become a champion of neurodiversity and the concept of learning differences rather than saying that a child has special needs or has a learning disability. I think it's taken a long time for us to realize that while in order to get students the supports they need, we often need to label them in some way, shape, or form. And that's the unfortunate situation that we are in, especially when it comes to funding. The only way to get kids the supports they need often is to get them some sort of label. And so I think that automatically makes things more challenging. Whereas if we were to equip every child with the knowledge that we all learn differently and you have to figure out what works for you, and as the adults, it's our job to help figure out what works best for each kid. I actually think we could empower students to be much more engaged in driving their own learning process and figuring out what works for them. I think special education means doing it well means being creative instead of saying, okay, so the services that we offer include just speech, or we can provide this particular academic service 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, or we can offer a small class. What about just thinking about things much more creatively? Are there ways where we can move kids in and out of different rooms, work with different folks in order to get what they need in a more creative way? So while I might need a smaller classroom in order to access some of the material and really be able to go deep so that my teacher can be as individualized as I need them to be, that might not be something I need all day. And those opportunities for me to engage with my peers are really important. So when can you build that in? For some kids, it might just be the specials, it might be lunch, it might be sports classes and arts and things like that. But for most kids, I actually think that there's a lot of academic content and social emotional learning opportunities where kids should be in more mainstreamed. But I think we get so stuck in the rigidity of what the services are supposed to be that oftentimes that becomes really challenging because we're not sure how to make it happen. And so it just doesn't.
Yeah, and I would argue that the students don't have a diverse set of experiences, right? They only have one experience that they kind of carry through their school and careers, and it does impact them when they go out into the larger world. So what advice would you give to parents like myself who has who has a child who learns differently than others and navigating the challenging terrain that is the quote unquote special education system?
Oh my goodness, so much advice. I'm trying to think about how I can be most succinct in my advice. I think one, always give yourself some grace. You are your child's biggest advocate, even if sometimes you don't know exactly what the right answer is. And I think oftentimes parents of children who learn differently don't give themselves that grace. They put a lot of guilt on themselves for, I should have done something sooner, I should have noticed something sooner, I should have changed something, or I should know what the answer is, why don't I? And the reality is, whether a child is typically developing or does have a variety of learning differences, it is always a journey. And the fact that you are even thinking about what is best for your child means that you are doing exactly what your child needs you to do in that moment. I think knowing that the folks who go into schooling, most of the time, they really deeply care about kids and want what's best for kids. So finding that one or two folks at the school building who you know love your child and want what's best for your child, and really working with them to partner to figure out what is best for your child, even if that might take some time and take some trial and error, will make a big difference. And I think 3, knowing what is happening outside of your school so that you can sometimes bring in ideas to your school can also be helpful. And it's not in a way that's like, why aren't you doing this? I heard other schools are doing this, but it might be, this might be an out of the box idea, but I've heard some schools are doing this, and knowing how my child learns, I'm wondering if that might be something that would work for my child. So I think there is always so much to learn, and it is unfortunate that sometimes parents are put into a role where they have to learn in order to be able to advocate for their kids. But I also think there are always folks at the school building who are doing that as well. And as much as you can partner with those particular folks, the better off your child is going to be. Does that answer your question?
It more than answers the question. Thank you. But you mentioned partnering with the school and bringing some of the ideas that are happening externally to your child's school building. What advice would you give, on the same note, for educators who are trying to navigate the system that they're just having to operate within? How do you, whether it be advocate differently, how do you navigate the system differently, right, to get the children in the building the services that they may need?
Absolutely. Well, number one, I think there is a lot you can do as an educator within your classroom. So whether you are a general homeroom teacher, you are a co-teacher in a co-teaching class, or you are the teacher of a small classroom where you're really individualizing and working with kids who have learning differences, I think there's a lot that you can do to educate yourself and differentiate for your students. I think one thing that I don't see happening a lot in the teacher development programs and the teacher schooling programs is really teaching teachers how to differentiate. We talk about it a lot as this like high level thing, but actually differentiating your work for your students, it's not that easy. It depends on what it is, but once you've done it a few times, it does come much more easy. And when you're doing it, you'll see the difference for your students and their willingness to try. So I think there are a few things that you can do that will actually make your classroom itself much more effective by thinking about how you can differentiate for students. And then immediately upon doing so, you're going to get more engagement from the students, which is going to make your classroom that much more effective and enjoyable for everyone. It's just going to bring a lot more joy and feelings of success for you and for your students. I think when it comes to getting your students the services they need, unfortunately, special education is bureaucratic. it's just what it is. And so you have to figure out who in your school building makes those decisions. What does that process look like? And you're going to have to do a little bit of educating yourselves. If you believe that one of your children and one of your students is a child who has a learning difference and they might need some different supports, they need you to advocate. No one knows that child and how they learn better than you do as their teacher. And so, as challenging as it may be, I think that is arguably one of the most important roles of a teacher, is to really think about and learn how each of their students learn and know when they need to advocate to get those students more individualized support.
Right. And what if you're a leader who now has teachers who come forward to say, I've noticed that, X percentage of my students or a child in my class has a particular learning need that we need to sort of look further into. How do I, as a leader, with teachers coming to me across multiple classrooms, advocate for the students in my building, outside of my building?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think our school leaders hopefully are in a position to make changes that benefit their students. And that might mean sitting down and saying, how can we be more creative about how we've structured some of our classes? Do we want to create a smaller classroom that we can rotate certain kids in and out of throughout the day, not where kids have to sit all day and they only know this one teacher, who's then forced, by the way, to learn all the different content areas and differentiate between them. Sometimes it's thinking more creatively. Do you want to have one teacher who, let's use middle school or high school as an example. Sure. I think that you can really think about your teachers and say, this teacher is going to teach 2 general education classrooms. They're going to co-teach 1 or 2 ICT co-taught classrooms with this other teacher. And then I want them to have one period where they have a small group where they're really doing differentiated work. And so if I'm a social studies teacher, I am prepping my social studies lesson for general education students. I'm prepping my lesson with a little bit more differentiation for my co-taught class with my co-teacher. And then I am taking that lesson and I'm really breaking it down and differentiating it and teaching it to my students who need that smaller group support specifically for social studies. I think that then allows us to really cater to the needs of the students and give them a more robust and authentic approach to school. Sure. And you can even pull in some of the small classrooms don't need to be just kids with learning differences. You can also think about ways that you could have a co-teacher in that classroom and have some of your more accelerated learners and differentiate on both ends of the spectrum, because we also know that kids learn best from each other. And so you could have some really great opportunities for those kids who are more accelerated to actually help teach the kids who need more differentiated learning approaches. And by doing so, you're developing leadership traits in those accelerated students, giving them opportunities to actually further their learning and challenge themselves. And you're going to have a stronger impact in how you're teaching your kids who do have learning differences. So I know a lot of this depends on your capacity. Right. There are definitely teacher shortages. So I will also name that I'm very aware that sometimes we don't have the ability to execute in this way. But I do think that where leaders have the ability to make some of these decisions, you can figure out ways to be more creative that will have a much more significant impact.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of teacher shortages, I mean, one of the things that, it's always been there, but I think since the pandemic, people have paid more attention to is sort of the mental health of our students, mental health of faculty, social emotional learning. It's just a big part of the schooling experience and should have always been, but now people are putting a lot more time and attention into that, which is really necessary. What can schools do better to support their faculty and their students in this area?
I think that is a fantastic question and one that I hope educators are asking everywhere. I know there has been a huge increase in the demand for social emotional learning and programming and supports. I think it is as simple as starting with how are students and teachers developing relationships with each other, students with each other, adults with each other, and adults with students. Are there actually opportunities for that relationship work to happen? It actually takes time. So looking at your schedule and saying, when can that happen is really important.
Right.
And how does that happen? I think sometimes we overthink it. It can be as simple as creating opportunities for folks to ask each other questions. It can be having students do self-reflective work and then engaging in dialogue circles. It can just be creating a space once a week or once a day, whatever you have, it doesn't matter. Making use of that time is what's most important, to sit down in a circle and say, let's talk about what's on our mind.
Yeah.
I think other things that I am really excited about, there are lots of different restorative practices that I think can be really powerful, and you can use them as you need them. If there's something that happens in the community, a crisis, you can have a listening circle for your whole class or your whole school to really, in small groups, engage in conversations about how that impacted them and what feelings they're having around that community crisis event.
Right.
I think also civic learning is incredibly exciting to me, and the idea that we can really engage students to develop their civic virtues by getting them to understand what's going on in their communities, in the world, and how they feel about it, what questions they have, and how it impacts them in their daily lives. I think if we're able to do that, we are then going to be developing much more of the leadership traits in our students, and they're going to have an increased level of empathy because they're going to be thinking about their place in the world and their place in their community and what they want that to look like.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of touched on this, but what would you say to, if I'm, a school principal or superintendent in a district, who might initially think I need some robust, detailed curriculum to be able to start this journey? What advice would you give me?
I think that it's a spectrum. I think knowing that you want to have social emotional learning play a larger role in your curriculum is number one. If that's where you are, you can only do well from there. I think, before you just go and implement a huge program, I think you first need to understand your community. I'll start back with how I answered question one, because every school community is different and what you need might be different. So taking the time to really figure out what is needed, where are some of the gaps, does the community really need, what are some of the challenges the community might be experiencing, and then thinking about which programs you can work to build that would actually target those specific needs is going to be really important. I think it can be a very detailed, very intensive program, and that's fantastic. I don't think it has to be if you are someone who does not have the ability to do that. I think some of these programs are expensive. And sometimes you have folks in the schools who are ready and equipped and know what their population needs, and they just need the permission to execute.
Yeah. I mean, a common theme that you've touched on is knowing your people, knowing your students, right? Knowing your community, knowing your families. And I think that is, if we are responsive to the folks right in front of us, right? First as human beings, right? I think that is the first step. And then the curriculum may be a more structured way of, going about meeting those needs. But certainly it does start with really, enthusiastic, energetic folks that we already have in our school buildings to do this important work. Julie, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure.
Likewise.